All right, we're back. How you doing? This is Dr. Robert Melillo. This is the Melillo Method podcast, Everything Brain, because it's all about the brain. And with my partner in crime here, Dr. Peter Scire. So I think, we've been covering some pretty cool stuff, but we have some interesting information that we want to share today.
And again, I don't have a good shirt. You always have the best shirts.
Hey, you mentioned something like I look like Nashville or cowboy or whatever, but my wife bought this shirt for me. It's actually the first time I'm wearing it. I hope it looks good. Maybe I look a little cowboyish. My daughter in Nashville would appreciate that. But, my wife will be happy about that. So.
She did good. Carolyn did really well on that one. I like
happy wife, happy life.
Exactly, right? All right. So today I think we want to kind of pick up on some concepts that we've been covering, loosely amongst the several podcasts we have. But I think one of the important topics that's always out there right now is we've talked about anxiety, but one of the other, co-founding or comorbidity that we see is really the OCD component of things. And both of us over the years have had really complicated cases where we've seen, children and young adults with very extreme OCD. And I know you recently had a, case that we co-managed that was pretty complicated.
Yeah, and I think along with that, which is often comorbid, are tics.
Yeah.
Or, in the autism community, they might be called Stims. And people don't really understand. They kind of overlap a lot, and people will say, well, they don't have tics, but they have Stims. Really, again, it comes down to understanding the neurology of it. And, so working with people and kids with tics and OCD is a big, big thing that we work with virtually everybody. And, we had a very high-profile case, obviously, that we worked with. And
so before we cover that, why don't we get into some of the neurobiology behind these tics? Because like you said, there's a lot of people probably saying a lot of weird stuff that's out there relative to these mechanisms. But in reality, we understand it that there is a huge discrepancy that's happening between two major areas of the brain, the basal ganglia and the frontal lobe, and the fact that we have these major pathways that come down that are influencing the basal ganglia, but the basal ganglia is obviously influencing what's going to the frontal lobe.
Right.
So, and I know that, over the years, I think some of the best papers you've ever written have been the basal ganglia papers that you wrote, as well as I know you contributed a chapter, you and Dr. Leisman contributed a chapter to a big textbook on basal ganglia.
Yeah.
And then, last year, I think in the paper in 2023, where you really tackled that in that frontal and maturation paper that we went over a couple podcasts ago.
Right.
But we might want to dive back into, again, those primary frontal striatal systems and get into some of the little circuitry that's in that basal ganglia system.
Yeah. So, tics, which is really involuntary, repetitive movements that are really kind of unnecessary, meaning they don't really serve much of a purpose, or they don't seem to. They're often referred to as stereotypies or stereotypies because these movements and or behaviors are considered to be stereotyped, meaning that, all humans do them to a certain extent, and we all do them pretty similarly. It's like if we were going to go pick up this cup of water and I did it and you did it, we would probably do it in almost the exact same way. And if we had, 100 more people, 99 out of 100 would do it exactly the way that we do it. Why? Because it's the most efficient way to do it. But it's so, programmed in us. It's literally part of our program of our brain that we're born with, that it's really part of an automated system that just happens. We don't really think about it. Like, you don't remember, okay, how did I choose to pick up this cup, right? You're not thinking about it. You're just doing it. And most of our behaviors are like that. It's kind of like habits. We most of what we do on a day-to-day basis are just really habitual. And even looking at how we form habits, that same area of the brain. And when we look at things like tics or Tourette's or OCD, literally in the scientific literature, it's called abnormal habit formation. So, forming habits and doing things and doing movements and doing it in the most efficient way, it's a key thing. But that system can go off the rails, and we can get all of a sudden certain stereotypical movements can pop up out of nowhere for no reason, that they're just triggered because they're housed in our brain and in this area called the basal ganglia. I mean, I had one girl one time, and she sneezed 12,000 times a day. That was her tic. Sneezing, we all sneeze in different ways, but mostly the same way, and it's triggered in our brain, and it's triggered for a reason, but it's literally a brain program that is triggered, and we sneeze, right? So we have a sensation, something in our nose triggers it, whatever it is, an itch or whatever, and then it triggers this program in our brain, and then once it goes, boom, we know that once you're going to sneeze, there's no way of stopping it, and then you sneeze, and then it's over, and there's a part of your brain that stops that. What happens if you're doing it 12,000 times a day without any stimulus? It means that program in the brain is tripping off, or maybe it was stimulated once and it went off, and then you couldn't turn it back off. And that is what is really going on with tics or Stims or OCD type behaviors. It's all related to the same neurological mechanism. It's just different pathways, but all really basically the same issue.
And in prior podcasts, we covered some of these pathways, and we covered some of the relationship of, in the basal ganglia, we have these two primary pathways. We have the direct pathway that basically says go,
right,
and then we have the indirect pathway that basically says no go, or some level of a kind of like a brake governor type of system.
Right.
And then we covered the hyperdirect pathway that we said that was discovered that primarily coming from the right side of the brain into that right basal ganglia, and you believe has a relationship to be able to modulate the direct pathway and assist the indirect pathway in terms of a no-go.
Right.
And so that stuck mechanism that you're talking about is really the fact that we're stuck in this go mechanism, and we're constantly firing the go system, and we don't have enough of the no-go system, or really that dominant brake coming from the hyperdirect pathway in the right side to say, hey, stop it.
Right.
Stop that motor output, okay, that will then cause a hyperactivity type of aspect or an impulsivity.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if we know it's more of a cognitive component of it, we're going to get more of an obsession mechanism. And then we also obviously have it tied into the limbic system. I know that your partner, Dr. Leisman, wrote a paper on tics and emotions, 2 years ago, where he really delved into the emotional side of it as well.
Right. Yeah, and looking at, basically two platforms of behavior, either hypokinetic or hyperkinetic. And with that, there are also emotions that might fall into the hypokinetic, like depression, like, where we have lower emotions or not as much affect. We're not showing a lot of emotions. We're very flat, like in someone who has Parkinson's. They don't have a lot of facial expression. They don't seem to show a lot of emotion. They may seem to be depressed. They may be cognitively slower. Their processing is slower. Their movements are slower or very, kind of stuck, almost like not flexible. And then on the other hand, there's hyperkinetic, where things like mania or anxiety or hyperactivity or, things that make us seem more, active or, more, we can't slow down, we can't calm down, moving quicker, talking quicker, and, being overactive and not having the ability to attend or be able to calm down, right? So those two pathways and those two behaviors affect how we move, it affects our emotions, it affects how we think, and it also has an impact, again, on our autonomic system and on our body as well. And, that basal ganglia, there's a right basal ganglia and a left, and in that basal ganglia, there are these two major pathways, as you said, the direct, which is the go, the indirect, which is the basically stop or inhibit. And then that is modulated by two other systems in the right brain, the hyperdirect pathway, there are two locations that we've talked about that modulate the physical component of it, the movement, so stopping the physical tics or the physical hyperactivity, or just being more physically agitated, and also in the frontal part of it, modulating the emotional and the cognitive component. So stopping the obsessive thoughts, or reducing the anger outbursts, or the agitation, or the perseveration of thinking or doing, or compulsion to do a certain act or do something over and over and over. So that is a braking mechanism. There is a mechanism that is also called the nigrostriatal pathway that favors the direct pathway a little bit, and that promotes movement and promotes going. And so that is what we see is usually deficient in Parkinson's. So that's why they're slow, or that's one of the reasons why they slow movement, slow thinking, low emotional tone. And then there's a deficit on the right that is what's going to produce hyperkinetic, where we have too much of that pathway. So the left and right brain, like everything, play a major role here in that.
Yeah, so it's a very delicate balance that exists in this basal ganglia, because again, we need that go mechanism. We need, for motivation. Like you said, like these patients that have, depressive thoughts. Again, this idea that they may have maybe more of a lack of that direct pathway. It's firing maybe predominantly more on that left side of their brain that doesn't allow them to create that motivation to get up out of bed in the morning, or stay on task and do things. So the output of that basal ganglia and that direct pathway and an indirect pathway is really governed by these major subnetworks that are coming down from the frontal lobe. And you've talked about and you've written about this extensively. So why don't we review for our listeners those 5 primary loops that we refer to as these frontal striatal systems, and go into that a little bit.
Yeah, so again, can't go through this enough, I think, but when we talk about development of the brain, the right brain is in the lead in development in the first 2 to 3 years. Some people say 2, I believe it's more 3, but in those 2 to 3 year period, the right brain is taking the lead. And we're also seeing bottom-up development, as we talked about pretty extensively, where we're building from the brainstem up, and then sensory information and movement information is going in, and it's going more towards the right brain. And we know that the right brain is more connected to bottom-up types of input, so that it's more connected with the body and input from the body, and regulating our body.
That insular cortex that we've talked about.
Right, and then we know that then the left brain develops, and we know that the left brain develops over the next 2 to 3 years. And the left brain is considered to be more top-down. So, we're getting both, doing both. But the right brain is more influenced on the bottom-up. The left brain is later to form, and then that's when the brain fully comes down, when both sides of the brain are really asymmetric like they're supposed to. And so in that, we're developing this, natural balance where the right brain should develop first. And as you've said, many times the right brain tends to be more inhibitory. So as it's developing, the right brain should come online first. It should be fully formed and dominant over the left brain as the left brain starts to come online. And it should be controlling it, basically regulating it.
And especially from that one area that, Alan Shore spent a lot of time talking about, that orbital frontal maturation.
Yes.
The orbital frontal development, this midline structure of our brain that really has a lot to do with inhibiting some of those primal midline structures of our middle part of our brain, like the amygdala and the anterior cingulate.
Right. That have a lot of our
self-regulation and
that inhibit a lot of our more primitive behaviors, but so, and that, like you said, that hyperdirect pathway really is that inhibitory into the basal ganglia. So as the left brain comes online, the right brain should be kind of controlling it. And the right brain is physically bigger. The right brain processes information much more quickly than the left. It processes multiple streams of information, so that the right brain really is now being looked at as really the more intelligent or smarter side of the brain, or the more important side of the brain. And, even though we've moved towards a left brain world, and we tend to think of the left brain as intellect and the left brain as, really the ultimate in intelligence, really emotional intelligence is more important. Being able to have the context of the whole world is more important. And the right brain should be really the master, as Ian McGilchrist talks about it. Yeah. And the left brain is really more, it kind of collects data. And it's more like a computer, meaning where information comes in. And information always comes into the right side of the brain first, and then flows over to the left. And then the left should kind of store that data in memory, analyze it, put it in a sequence, either timeline or sequence, so that it can use it for predictions. It is going to put it in categories. It's going to, try to put words to it in some way, and then it's going to use it to go get a goal, right? It's goal directed. Mm-hmm. It's going to use to get a goal, and then it's going to want to remember that and repeat it and do it over and over and over again. And it's kind of aggressive, and it's more isolated. And then it should go back to the right brain, where the right brain can put it into a full understanding. The right brain is wisdom. The right brain is really understanding, large concepts, problem solving. The left brain is really more knowledge, but the right brain is really understanding the context of this information. Yeah,
metaphorical aspects.
Yeah, in the world that we live in, and, our life, and how does it fit? And so to truly understand something at the deepest level, you need to have that right brain ultimately. And that's the way it should work. And if, that right brain isn't developing properly, and if that left brain comes online too early, which is what we see in autism and OCD and tics and all of those.
That hyperlexia.
Hyperconnective, right. And that's one of the signs, when they're reading. I mean, I had a father a couple of days ago that had this one child, and the child was, really bright. I mean, they were reading at like 3 years of age, and the kid was already a math genius. I mean, he was
that little professor syndrome that we were talking about.
But he's like 3.5 years old, and this kid was doing math problems and everything, right? But he was autistic. And, father was telling me, he said, when he was 8 months old, I was holding up my fingers to teach him numbers, and he was learning it at 8 months of age. Mm-hmm. He was able to understand that symbol analogy and, again, abstract knowledge, which you shouldn't be able to know at that age. You shouldn't be able to read at that age. You shouldn't be able to,
that consciousness,
it shouldn't be
process,
there yet, right? Yeah. And that's where, when people are doing flashcards at an early age, and I'm wanting my kid to read when they're 1. Yeah. If your kid's reading at 1, it's a problem, because it means you just stopped their right brain from developing. Yeah. Just like if you're sticking iPhones in their faces or anything like that. Yeah. Just like, I'm going to bring this up. It's a little random, but this is a really important thing. One of the worst things you can do for a small child is to swaddle them and to restrict their movements. Yeah. And right now that's epidemic. Yeah. All these moms are out there on the internet, and they're swaddling their kids up. And I know they're doing it because they think they want to keep them safe and they love them, but kids have to move. Yeah. They have to have the freedom to move their body. The worst thing you can do is to stop them from movement. Yeah. And I don't know where this came around, and I've never seen any sort of expert say that this is what should be done. It's really some moms that are out there that just, are like these Instagram moms that say this is really good and these are cute things, but it's a bad thing. And this is one of these things that will just stop that development of that right brain.
Yeah, I remember my own kids. My own kids were always crawling all over me, even when they were young, even at 6 months or 9 months. You want to hold them, and all of a sudden they just want to get down. They want to move. They want to, just search their environments. We weren't holding them close in like this nonstop.
Yeah. I did remember when I was writing my textbook, I was looking into this because, that's always a question. People are like, should I let my kid crawl or should I hold them all the time, or should I swaddle them? And so I really looked at the research, and it was really interesting. There was this one scientific paper that was written where they really went back and they looked in tribes from around Arizona that went back like 2,500 years or something. I mean, it went back a long time. And there were 2 tribes that were relatively close to one another. But one tribe would swaddle and using papooses or things like that, and they did not allow the babies to just crawl. The other tribe, the child would they never did that, and the children would all roam free. And what they did was they looked at the literature, they looked at the language, the art, the culture of the two civilizations. And the civilization that allowed kids to crawl was tremendously more sophisticated in their art, in their language, in their, everything, in their culture, their architecture, versus the ones that swaddled their kids. They were very, very primitive. They really didn't progress much. So just looking at that, it kind of seemed as, an example of representation that, if you really want to see better cognitive development, if you want to develop a child that's smarter and more and is going to interact in the world better, let them move early on. Don't restrict them. Yeah. So, again, I just had to throw that out there because this is something that I've been seeing lately that kind of drives me crazy. And again, I know that, the moms or whoever is promoting it are well-meaning. I'm not saying that they're doing it deliberately to hurt kids, but it's a bad thing. Don't do it.
Yeah. So as we were saying, we were talking about these loops, and we were referring to the right brain coming online, then we get the left brain coming online more at around that 2.5-year or 3-year mark. But as the hemispheres are starting to link up more, what we're definitely going to see is this relationship where both frontal lobes are going to fire down these very specific pathways, and one of them being the orbital frontal area. But we also know that we see the frontal eye fields begin to really emerge, and now we start getting these very complicated eye movements that also contribute to cognition. And we see the lateral portion of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that has a lot to do with so much of our executive function start to come online more.
Yes.
And so, and then we have our anterior cingulate pathway that's going to be there for motivation. Mm-hmm. So, these primary loops that are now developing because, we said bottom up, but now we're starting to get that top down modulation of these inputs that are going to be more specific to telling us and signaling to our complex brain, our frontal lobe, on what to do.
Right. Yeah, and those loops and those networks are important, and there are different versions on the right and left brain. But as you said, we have different areas of the brain physically, different structural areas. We know that the brain is localized. Anybody that says it isn't or doesn't understand that, we know that it's localized. And we know that the right and left brain do different things, and they regulate things differently, and that's a great advantage. Attention, so when we talk about the frontal eye fields and eye movements, being able to regulate our eye movements, because where we put our vision is where we put our attention, and attention allocation is really important. Whatever we attend to is what becomes our reality at that point. And we have different types of attention. We talked about that. But, as an example that we use it again, if you take an animal like a bird and they need to have very focused, narrowed attention to be able to look for a seed on the ground amongst pebbles, but at the same time, they need to be able to pay attention to predators. If you didn't have two sides of the brain doing different things, you couldn't have that. If you had only one center for attention, or a center for attention, that were equal on both sides of the brain, that it did exactly the same thing, you would either focus on the seed or focus on the prey. You either had this broad attention looking for everything, or you'd have this narrow attention looking for a detail. And you couldn't do both at the same time. Mm-hmm. And then you would be eaten by predators, or you wouldn't find your food, right? So, again, why do we have two sides of the brain? Why would we have two things? Because that is the perfect example of why. And E. McGilchrist gives that example all the time, and it's a great example. But, if we didn't have different attention in different parts of the brain, we couldn't use them together. We couldn't use them cooperatively. But sometimes we need to really focus our attention and shut out the whole world and shut it down. And so we need to narrowly focus, and then we inhibit the other side so that we don't get competition from it. So the brain is wired to be able to do that. And only by having two centers in the brain and two halves of the brain can we do that. But we have these different networks, and so the frontal eye field is one of the ways that we're going to be focusing our attention. Again, we have executive functions, but we have different executive functions regulated by the right brain and the left brain. But all of the executive functions are regulated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We have social, attachment, emotional regulation, which is mostly going to be from the orbital frontal. But again, the right and left brain do different things, or they can work cooperatively, but they also, work to compete. And then we have, as you said, the anterior cingulate, and we have it modifies motivation. So again, when we need motivation, we're really motivated. We get up and go. The left brain kind of does that. When we need to calm our motivation down, to relax, not be so, all right, calm down a little bit. Too much motivation is mania. Too little motivation is apathy, right? We need to have a balance, but sometimes we need to be like, just relax and chill out and don't be so motivated. And other times we need to really generate that motivation. And so we have two centers of the brain and sometimes we need to be able to do it really fast and flexible. And then, we have the motor part of our brain, which is the part of our brain that controls all of our movement. And that area of the brain is primarily in the supplemental motor area, what's called Brodmann area 6 on both sides. And the left side of the brain activates movement, turns on movement, activates those programs in the basal ganglia, activates sneezing, activates laughing, activates, the physical facial features of that, or the physical movement component of it, or clearing our throat, or doing something repetitively, or grooming ourselves, or whatever it is, right? There's a physical program movement, complex movement. Speech is generated by this area of the brain, and it is inhibited by the right, and that is where the hyperdirect pathway is. So again, we need to be able to balance those things out, and when we have too much in that Brodmann area, supplemental motor area, too little in the right, we're going to have tics, we're going to have stimming, we're going to have repetitive movements, repetitive actions. If we have too much in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we're going to have thoughts that we can't stop. If we have too much in the orbital frontal cortex on the left, we're going to have compulsive behaviors and maybe anger outbursts or aggressive, type of motivation, or too much we're pursuing pleasure and hedonistic things too much, like hypersexuality or hyperphagia, eating too much. And that's the way these things work. And if we have multiple things going on at the same time, or a lot of those areas are all underdeveloped, we may have all of those things at the same time, which is typically in autism. We see that they have ADHD type symptoms. They're hyperactive. They're, very often impulsive. They have, very strong OCD. One of the things from the very beginning, I asked parents, did your child have OCD early on? Did they open and close closets a lot? Or, the cabinets, did they turn on and off lights a lot? Did they ever line up toys? And in almost every case, it's either all of those or at least one of them, right? Where they'll be like, oh, yeah, they lined up the toys. Or, yep, they turned the lights on, they still do it. They can't, they're going to come into a room, they have to close the door, and then they open it, and then they close it. And this is one aspect of OCD, and there's different types of it, but you see it really early on, and it's all of these things is just a sign that that overactive left hemisphere function.
Yeah, I remember many years ago, probably like 15 years ago, we had a young boy in one of the facilities where he couldn't tolerate the sound of the flushing toilet in the elementary school. And every time he would go in, like he would urinate, and they couldn't flush the bowl, because if he flushed the bowl, he would just lose it.
Right.
And so, but I think 2 points that came up was, one, the importance of how the hemisphere allows us to have flexibility, and two, the fact that we have, when we're looking at these long-range networks that we know are underdeveloped in these imbalance models, these functional connection models, and where we see this hyper overdevelopment or overconnectivity in one side, and the hypoconnectivity on the other side, the lack of inhibition that we're getting from those long-range networks.
Right.
And so that we see, and as we talked about in prior episodes where we've talked that how they're not going to grow out of this, that if anything, the hyperkinetic side is going, or the hyperkinetic side is going to get more and more connected and stronger within that hemisphere, which is then going to come down and further and inhibit that immature hemisphere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, dynamically, as we talked about, having these different areas of the brain working together, like we said, with attention, narrowed attention, broad attention at the same time, keeps us alive and lets us get food. Speech, communication, verbal communication with words, using them in a certain sequence, in a certain way, is very important. Nonverbal communication, tone of voice, prosodity, facial expression, gestures, the motivation of what are we trying to say, right?
Or the right Italian brain, that's coming out in you.
Yeah, the right brain wants to talk about my experiences and my day and my emotions and my feelings. The left brain just wants to talk about needs. It really doesn't want to talk much if it doesn't have to, but it wants to talk about needs. It wants to talk about facts. It wants to maybe repeat things that it said. But, it wants to use, it's literal. It's the literal meaning of the word. The right brain is the non-literal meaning. It's what between the lines or how you're saying it. Both of those need to work together, right? But if there's a point where you're really trying to get across emotionally how you're feeling, you may want to emphasize that right brain part more. And you may not be able to find the words during that time, or your speech may become less, or your voice may become softer, or you may stutter a little bit because you're shutting down the left as you're really emphasizing that. But you're getting across through eye contact and maybe through emotions and through gestures, you're getting across how important this is to me. On the other hand, certain times you might be really precise about the words I'm saying, like I'm just reading a book out loud, or I'm saying a speech. And what happens to a lot of people, their emotions go down and they don't really have much gestures and they sound kind of robotic. And because there's this delicate balance of sometimes we need to cooperate. Most of the time when we're doing a conversation, it should be both. And the whole brain is working and they're working together, and I'm saying the words and I'm giving you the gestures and you're hearing the words and understanding the words and you're picking up on my gestures and you're getting it all together and you get the whole totality of the conversation. Yeah. That's ideal. But there are certain times when, one will interfere with the full activation of the other and we need to inhibit one another. If any sort of delicate imbalance is, thrown off, and we have, one side gains too much advantage, now we use that and we're chronically inhibiting the other side. Yeah. And now they're not used cooperatively. And one of the, I think, best things that Ian McGilchrist put in his book is that even though, we may have the right brain does, let's say the left brain's primary verbal and the right brain is nonverbal. But the right brain can do words. It just doesn't do it as well as the left brain. Yeah. And the left brain can do emotions. It just doesn't do it as well as the right. So you would say, well, okay, so, maybe it's like, 85% of the time the left brain's doing it, but 25% of the time the right brain is involved in verbal communication or whatever, because maybe they're sharing. But he says, no, that's not how it works. If one side is even a little bit better than the other, it's 100%. 100% of the time, that part of the brain is going to control that function. Mm-hmm. And the other side will do the other 100%. Even though that potential is there, right? But the fact is, it's because that's efficient. It wouldn't be efficient to go back and forth. And why would I use the right brain when I can use the left brain the whole time? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's really important, because that's another thing that it's really hard to measure in like QEEG or EEG or fMRI, that one side of the brain is doing this particular job 100% of the time, and the other side is either doing the other job cooperatively, and they're both lit up, But one part of the brain is doing the verbal and saying the words, and the other part is all the nonverbal. But when we look at it when someone's speaking, we go, well, it's both sides of the brain are active. So both sides of the brain, both responsible for it. So this whole idea of asymmetry isn't there. Completely untrue.
Yeah, and I think that is what throws off a lot of people at times when they read papers and they see regions of interest that are being studied and they see some bilateral activation. Okay. But then again, when you look at it as a dominancy of that hemisphere, this is what the right brain we know. We know the right brain is superior for comprehension, whether it's done from a reading level to a listening level. We know the right brain is dominant for context. It's what's going to allow us, again, to have read the metaphors or understand metaphors and similes. It's not going to be literal. Left brain will be literal and logical and sequential. And I think you're right. Ian made a great, point of that, is that saying that, hey, these are the dominant features of that hemisphere.
Right. If one side has even a little advantage, it's not that they share the job. That one side will do it 100% of the time, right? And, again, I was just reading that book, The Divided Therapist, and I was reading Dan Siegel's chapter. I don't know if you read that, but, he's, a very eloquent writer. And like McGilchrist, I just love reading the way that they put things. But, he's also, because for the most part, in the politically correct aspect of neuropsychology or in the neuroscience world, not exactly sure why, but, again, it's not really as politically correct to talk about, especially personality, as a right brain and left brain personality. So if we say this person's a right brain person or this person's more of a left brain person, it's not kind of, in mainstream psychology, they try not to do that. Mostly because I don't think they don't really know about the brain too much. But Dan Siegel is doing this, and in the chapter he's talking about, in a very politically correct way, about how, yes, the whole brain works. And again, that we may see somebody and we may say whatever abruptly, that person is very left brain. But we know that it's more complex than that. And he goes through the whole thing, and he's very eloquent, and he's, steering around how all sides of the brain work, and it works on this. And then he starts slowly building it. But if you have somebody that, they have, we know that the right brain does this, and the right brain is responsible for this, and we know that the left brain is more important for this, and and he goes through it, and by the end of it, he's basically coming out saying, so the fact that there is a right brain personality and a left brain personality, you could clearly argue for that, and it's funny because I didn't think he was going to go there in the beginning. I thought he was going to go towards, trying to not be controversial or whatever and just kind of go, yeah, the whole brain, and there is maybe some laterality, but he ended up doing it was almost by accident, to a whole argument of how clearly, there are the two sides of the brain see the world in different ways. Mm-hmm. And if you're more, if you have one side of your brain is a little bit more dominant and you use that side more, it will become more dominant. That become more of your dominant view. And then that would make more of that and would feed into itself. And so therefore, like when I talk to people and I say, there's a trait that makes your kids more susceptible to certain, skills or cognitive skills. And I talk about, and I think Simon Baron-Cohen has said the same thing, that, basically, kids that are autism, their parents, you see in their families that it's kind of like, an engineering brain. Yeah. They have more like an engineer brain. And most people will go, yeah, okay, I get that. Yeah, like I know people that are engineers and they're logical and and they may be reserved and they're, and they are very intelligent and they're very smart and they're very methodical the way they do it. And, whereas you have other people that you'd be like, well, this person might be more of an artist type of mentality. And you could say, okay, I get that. You know what I mean? They're like really kind of free form and creative and big picture and not good with details. I mean, these things exist. And, I think we need to just understand it more because it's also the core when we start looking at, mental health issues of all kinds and ultimately how we're going to really have the biggest impact on them.
Yeah, and I think you're right with the traits, these dominant traits, because I know, recently just onboarding some new patients in my office in Atlanta, and, the topic always comes up about how did this happen? And, and everybody, there's all these theories that are out there and all these different, risk factors and everything. And obviously you extensively wrote about it in the autism book. But as we've seen over the years that you've been doing this and the years I've been doing this, that one of the bigger things is these traits, these hemispheric traits that are being passed down generationally. And a lot of times, I found that not only asking, really asking the parents about the grandparents and saying, okay, especially like granddad, like if granddad was that engineer, okay, and then likely if they had a son or a daughter, they were, and definitely the son being more, dominantly maybe engineer, and then, okay, now the grandson is got these off the chart gifted left brain traits. So when we have these gifted left brain traits, the unfortunate side of it is that, it brings on these OCD tendencies and these tic tendencies and, the anxiety. So in the last few minutes, I know we kind of curved around a little bit to where we wanted to be, but why don't we just briefly discuss, some of the case that you wanted to mention about, some of the severity that you saw in that particular case with the tics and the OCD that you saw.
Yeah, so a lot of people know that Kevin James was on Joe Rogan's show. And I think most people out there, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably familiar with Joe Rogan's podcast, whether you listen to it or agree with him or not. It's the most popular podcast in the world by far. I think he gets like 40 million listeners every time, which is amazing. I remember he was, talking to, I think, Tucker Carlson, who at the time had the largest viewership of anybody, which was 4 million. And that was a lot. And he gets 40 million every time. So, it's a big platform. And Kevin really, if you listen to the interview, he very specifically at some point directed the conversation towards his daughter and towards their experience with me. And, he had told me that he wanted to do that because he wanted to, raise awareness for people. He has a daughter who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, very bright girl. I mean, the girl is an amazing artist. I mean, she's, if you ever see her drawings, digital drawings she does, incredible. And she created like books that were almost like Lord of the Rings with their own language and everything. A brilliant girl. But she also, had struggled with, classic symptoms that would be associated with autism, OCD and, problems with socialization. And she also had, really bad eczema. She wasn't sleeping at all. And these are all things that Kevin talked about. So, I'm just putting out there what he's already put out there. And, but, one of the things we had talked about, and I think we're going to talk about more, was this idea of interoception, of being able to feel your body and be connected with her body. And she was so disconnected from her body feelings that she often, didn't know when she had to go to the bathroom. And she would hold on to urine sometimes for days on end. And then when she did go, she may not have completely emptied. And this is a common problem we see because, again, not feeling your body, not being connected. And she would get sick and she'd develop a fever, but she didn't really know it. So she didn't really feel like she was sick. This is a lot of what we see in autism is that these kids get sick, but they don't look like they're sick. Mm-hmm. They don't feel sick because they don't really feel pain. They don't have what we call sickness behavior. They may not get a fever. And so that would happen. And one time she seemed to, have such a bad infection going that it triggered these tics, and these were terrible tics, full body tics, screaming, yelling, hitting herself, really violent, and thousands of them a day. And it was heartbreaking for them as a family. And so Kevin, his wife found my book because they had gone to a hospital out here on Long Island, which is the #1 children's hospital in the country. They brought her in there in the emergency, just saying, help my daughter with these tics. And they looked at her and they literally were like, we can't do anything for this. You can't do anything for that. Mm. So they just said, learn to live with it. It's going to be like this for the rest of her life. And so they didn't want to accept that. They found my book, and they reached out to me, and they said, can you help? And I said, yeah, I think I can. And they brought her in, and we did my program of really activating. And so what were we trying to do? We're literally trying to inhibit that area that we talked about, that supplemental motor area, because that's where the tics come from. That area was out of control, and the other side, the right side, was so underdeveloped. But again, she had all her primitive reflexes were there. The bottom-up stuff was never built. There was this developmental trajectory so that the foundation of the brain had never been solid. And, and the right brain and the left brain came online too early and too strong because she's a brilliant girl. And, that's her trait. And it, came online, even though I think Kevin's clearly a right brain dominant person. But, so we specifically targeted that. We worked on our primitive reflexes. We helped to build the foundation, to make the foundation of her brain solid, to get rid of those reflexes, to build her stability, to build her, connection to her body, to get her to feel her body, to improve her interoception and her proprioception and her muscle tone. But also then top down, target those specific areas of the brain by slowing down, by using photobiomodulation to literally slow down brain waves in that area of the brain and in the orbital frontal cortex where she had obsessive behaviors from and compulsive behaviors, and bring it up in the right and speed up the brain on that right side. And within about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, her tics were gone. And it's a really fascinating story about that. We can talk more about that as well. But, and many people said, how did you do that? I mean, because most people would say that the tics, you can't change them. Mm-hmm. But it's knowing the neurology, knowing where they're coming from, knowing what areas of the brain are causing it. And we were able to, in a very specific, very directed, very aggressive way, really completely change it. And it was, a really big thing. And for him, it was life-changing for him and his family. And he felt like, wow, other parents need to know about this, and I just want to help other people. Mm-hmm. And so he said, he wanted to develop a not-for-profit arm. He wanted to be able to raise money to be able to help families and people to get the proper treatment. But he said, but I don't want to come out and sound like I'm promoting things, because I'm not. I'm not trying to, I want it to come up naturally. He said, I'm going to be on a show. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be promoting a movie or something, and it's going to come up, and then I'm going to talk about this, and I want to be able to do this so that the world knows what you're doing and knows that there is help and there is hope. And so it was great. He went on Joe Rogan, and as soon as, he turned it towards his daughter. And then, he right away threw out there, my daughter is on the spectrum, and she had developed these horrible tics. And Joe said to him, how did he do it? And Kevin was like, oh, I don't know how to do it.
I remember him going, I'm no doctor, so I'm not sure how it happened.
Right.
But no, I think the message here is the idea that, we have to identify this imbalance, and we have to identify the overactive side, begin to, through the assessment process that you do in your office, I do in my office every day, to be able to look at that gap, because we're always really searching for that magnitude of gap that's there, because that magnitude is going to really dictate the severity of the symptoms in a lot of ways. Okay, right. And this is why, for so many of our families out there, they start out with one single diagnosis, and then over time, as that child is aging, they're chronologically aging, but the developmental difference is gapping. And so now we see that child that once was maybe a type 1 inattentive child that now develops hyperactivity, impulsivity. Oh, they go over here to this specialist, and now they have a tic disorder or a Tourette's, or they're diagnosed with a mood disorder, or they're diagnosed with oppositional defiance, or now as they get into their adolescent years, it's OCD, anxiety, and so on. And so I think the message that we're always trying to say is, let's identify that imbalance as soon as possible. And as we've said in multiple episodes, where we can identify this at such an early age. I mean, we can identify it below 3 years old. I mean, I think, on the way over here, we were talking about some of the new, and we're going to get into this, but the new rates that are coming out about autism. But, and for the most part, most kids are still not getting diagnosed till around 3.5. So where we're saying, no, we can identify this definitely below 12 months of age. And so I think that's the big thing here, is just trying to get our families and people out there to say, hey, got to get to somebody, whether it's us or somebody we've trained, to get their child assessed right away, or read the Disconnected Kids book so they can do some of the assessment at home. Because the sooner we can identify this imbalance, the sooner we can correct it and change the child's developmental trajectory forever.
Yeah, it's about getting to the core issue. And anytime I talk to parents, many times they'll tell me, I don't feel like anybody's ever gotten to the core. And it's not just in kids, it's also in adults or people that are struggling. I mean, anybody listens to my Instagram or watches my Instagram, it was just my birthday, and there was a young man, and he's a great kid. I've known him, most of his life, and talented guy. I mean, he was a great athlete as a kid, very smart. He was one of my nephew's best friends growing up. And a few years ago, he was diagnosed with, bipolar and depression. And he was really going down a bad road. He was drinking too much and all of those things. And we were at a party one day, and he was really talking to me about how bad it was. And I said to him, listen, come see me, come see me. And, big right brain, over-dominant. And he at that point now, he was pretty much, stuck in his house for 2 years. He, had all these job offers because he was very competent, but he didn't take them. He said, because I know I won't last. And he had tried all the medications. He had tried, cognitive behavioral therapy. And it all helped to a certain degree, but not too much. I mean, he still was completely non-functional. And I wasn't really aware of it, but he started off this post. He wrote a beautiful post to me on my birthday, and we posted it. You should go and, look at it. His name was Isaac Wade, and it starts off by saying, I had a suicide attempt. And that's, he had tried to kill himself. Right. And then he goes through the story of, and he was thanking me on my birthday. And it was one of the most beautiful things anybody's ever said to me. But it really comes down to this. If you go back in his childhood, he had primitive reflexes. Where he ended up was because he was so gifted with his right brain. And, one of the things about him that was really cool is because at one point I asked him, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? I mean, like, you're not working right now. You're not taking on any jobs. What do you want? And he said, I can't even think about it now. And I said, well, just think back when you were like a kid. What would you have wanted to be? And he said, I think I wanted to be a stand-up comedian. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool, right? And I said, have you ever done it? He goes, no. Again, I'm too afraid to do that. I'm too stand up. And so now he's a stand-up comedian. And he's great. He's really, really good at it, right? So now he has he's overcome that, and now he's been able to fully, and that's the point. We're not trying to change anybody. We're trying to bring out the best version of that person, the person you always dreamed about, the child you always dreamed about. I always say to parents, this is not the best version of your child. We accept them as they are, and we love them as they are. But this is not the best version of them. How do I know that? Because they have all these reflexes, they have all these imbalances, they have all these things going on where, it's not where they should be. And we can help them become a better version of themselves, or even the optimal version of themselves. And that's all we're trying to do. But without understanding the brain, without understanding what the root cause is, you're never going to do that. All you're just going to do is try to manage symptoms and regulate things, and and that can help. But you're never going to achieve the optimal version of yourself or of your child unless you really understand what the root cause is. And the root cause is almost always in the brain.
Well, once again, it was great sitting down with you and always getting to navigate these questions that I've always wanted to ask you and get these answers so we can help as many families as we can, because I know that's what you're passionate about. I know it's what wakes me up every day. So again, it's always my pleasure to be here with you and to pick your brain.
Same thing, man. I mean, who's got a better job than us, right? I mean, like I always say to people, you talk about a purpose in life. A lot of people struggle with, what's my purpose? Why am I here? Well, any purpose you have, it really should be about helping other people. And then helping people that, especially children that are the most innocent, and people and children that can't speak for themselves, and trying to help them. So, I mean, I just feel blessed, and I'm really happy to do this with you, because, I wouldn't do this on my own, I would just kind of say, okay, I'll put it out there, and I'm not one that's going to go out and kind of, ego-driven, trying to tell people, listen, but I want people to know this, and it is important. So you're giving me the opportunity to do that, so thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Well, everyone, we'll see you in a couple weeks. Hopefully we'll be back up here soon and get some more episodes recorded.
Okay, check us out. Again, it's on Spotify, it's on Apple. You can find out about it through my Instagram. It's also on a YouTube channel. Okay, so it's all out there. So we'll see you soon. Okay.